So it's funny because my process isn't like that complicated or anything too crazy. A lot of my so like when I do my work by hand, I I typically start in Photoshop, or I'll do a sketch and bring it into Photoshop and then kind of sketch over it, right? And when I do Photoshop, I typically do like regions, kind of like shapes and regions with nodes. So part of the it's funny because I kind of started doing that naturally without even knowing um, that was probably optimal for SVGs, right? So then when I jumped into trying to make art on Bitcoin, I was like, okay, I have these JPEGs. I need to reduce them. And then doing a little bit of research, talking to friends, what made sense was trying to convert things to as simple as possible SVGs, right? And there are so many ways that you can convert a JPEG to an SVG um, manually, and that's typically what I do, right? I use tools like Adobe Express is actually one of my favorite ones. So going from Photoshop to SVG file format, I use their tool, and it gives a pretty decent result. Not perfect, but pretty decent, right? Where you have just kind of the converted nodes into SVG format. And basically, what it means is just like mathematical node locations in the XY or XZ plane, right? It's just nodes. Um, and so once I have that in as an SVG, I work in something so like I typically do use Illustrator, but there's obviously other programs out there that natively work with SVGs. But Illustrator is what I have because I have the Adobe suite, so I have Photoshop, Illustrator, and whatnot. So naturally, that made sense to me. And in an Illustrator, what I end up doing is kind of looking at it overall, looking at the result, and seeing where things are messed up. So, and this can take a long time because you know you don't want your thing to look not as intended, right? You also don't, the whole point of it is to try to reduce the amount of size that the file is. So for SVGs, right, every node is file weight. Think of it like that, right? So there's ways to kind of like optimize the curves of your areas of that you have shaded in colors or whatever. Um, and so basically, for example, like if I have a shape that has, I don't know, 10 nodes, right? I see if I could kind of stretch it and play around with it to make it 2 nodes, right? So that's really reducing it quite drastically. And again, this is manual because like using the initial tool to kind of get you there starting. I like to have freedom on, choice on, how I want to kind of stretch and move different objects on top of each other. So this is the piece that kind of takes me a while. Now, you could also just start an Illustrator. No big deal, right? You could just start creating, regions with nodes and colors, and even bring in a background to kind of straight, trace over. But my workflow has always been go to Photoshop first, and part of the reason why I actually do that is well, 2 reasons. One, because that's how I started doing digital art. But second, most important reason is once I'm kind of very close to done with my work, I look at the file that the JPEG is, the file size, and like if it's like uh, well, in my case, since I do mostly stamps, I'm looking at something that's like about 2 to 4 megabyte in that range, because that gives me an idea. That gives me like confidence that I could bring it down to the stamp requirement of less than 65 kilobytes with just node manipulation. So I'm kind of looking at that, that idea. Now, if my piece exceeds that, then I know that I'm going to have a very tough time trying to bring it down. So then at that point, I have to kind of like make a decision in my head, like a design decision. What can I remove that doesn't, take away from the message that I'm trying to convey here? Um, but yeah, so modification and manipulation of nodes in SVG format is the best way to really reduce the file size. And again, like it is a long process. And in itself, I would say it is an art, right? That's where the compressionism comes in, right? It's like you're trying to convert something to as small as possible without damaging the image or damaging the story that you're trying to convey, right? And that in itself is an art, in my opinion. But yeah, it takes a long time. Another tool that I actually use quite often, especially if I have like if I have gradients or anything like that that I'm trying to kind of fade a color to another color, is I actually mess with the SVG code because what happens is that when it's converted to an SVG, and SVG is just kind of like it's just code. It's just code, mathematical code defining nodes and defining colors, and you could open it in any code viewer, right? And it's literally just line by line code, right? So you can go into the code and also manipulate and optimize things. So like I do this quite often with gradients, for example. So you could go into the code and see where the gradient is, and then kind of change some of um, the values that the gradient is trying to go from one color to the other. So and by that I mean like maybe just make it slightly simpler without taking away from the effect, right? So, for example, if you're going from red to blue, there's a bunch of colors in between, right? Let's just say like a normal gradient in Photoshop could be, I don't know, hundreds of colors, right? And so you kind of play around with that and reduce it to maybe 20 colors, right? Within the code. Um, and that can drastically change the size of the file as well. Um, but and then also like you take a look at it, does it affect what you're trying to convey? If it doesn't, then you're okay, right? Then it's not that big of a deal. um but there's definitely a little bit of wiggle room there to play with. So when I'm looking at the code, I actually also sometimes utilize AI to kind of look at the code with me. So I'm like, hey, where can we optimize the great like with the gradients, right? And so AI is not perfect with this because it's more of like there has to be a human eye to it, but it's definitely a good start. You can ask any AI. I prefer Grok, but there's others out there, and they look at the code, they give a recommendation. You can try it. If it doesn't, again, like it's an AI, it's not looking at the actual image itself. So it gives you an idea, but then you could still mess around with the optimization of the color gradient. So that's kind of like in a nutshell what I do. And then ultimately, I'm reducing something from 2 to 3 megabytes down to less than 65 kilobytes.